Whitney Calloway walked past the private property sign for the 13th time, a chainsaw crew, and a stack of forged violation notices trailing behind her, certain that no landowner could ever stop. A homeowners association determined enough to take what it wanted. Grant Hollis said nothing that morning. He simply watched and he recorded. Every footstep, every felled tree, every hour she had no right to be there. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at Whitney's door demanding $98,500, and she laughed until the sheriff showed up behind it. Grant Hollis owned 146 acres of pine forest, bordering the gated community known as Silver Pines Estates in the small Colorado town of Redstone Hollow. His land held a narrow creek, an old logging road cut decades earlier, and a stone house his grandfather had built with his own hands more than 60 years before. Silver Pines Estates had been built long after the Hollis family already held the deed, and the line between the two properties had always been marked with fencing survey stakes and weathered signs warning against trespassing. Grant kept to himself. He worked for years as a land use appraiser for the county before retiring early to manage the family property, and he had never joined the homeowners association, never signed a shared use agreement, and never given anyone permission to set foot past that boundary. Neighbors who had lived near Silver Pines Estates for years described Grant as quiet but fair, the kind of man who waved from his porch but rarely accepted invitations to the clubhouse potlucks. He had inherited a healthy respect for boundaries from his grandfather, who used to say a fence line meant something whether or not anyone else agreed to honor it. Grant had spent enough years working for the county to know exactly how easily paperwork could be twisted, exaggerated, or simply invented by someone determined enough to try. That professional background would prove far more valuable than he realized the first time Whitney Calloway showed up, uninvited, clipboard in hand, speaking about his land as though it were already hers to plan. Whitney had just been re-elected president of the association for a third consecutive term, and she wanted to raise property values with a new project she called the Silver Pines Nature Loop, a walking trail, nearly 3 miles long, reserved for residents only. She had pitched the idea at a gala dinner months earlier, showing glossy renderings of families strolling beneath tall pines beside a gentle creek, and the board had applauded without asking a single hard question. The most scenic stretch of that trail, unfortunately for her, would have to cut straight through more than an acre of land that belonged to Grant, following the creek and winding beneath his oldest pines. Instead of asking permission, Whitney sent a letter announcing her plans, declaring that the association was activating what she called a historic right of access along the old logging road. Grant checked the deed and confirmed no such easement had ever existed for the association. Not in the original plat, not in any recorded amendment, and not in a single county file going back generations. He wrote back politely explaining that the land was private, was never part of Silver Pines Estates, and that any attempt to enter it would be refused and documented. Whitney showed up at his gate days later, with 2 board members trailing behind her, insisting that residents had been using that road for years, and that Grant had no right to stop them now. Grant pointed to the survey markers and asked her to produce any legal document proving the association's claim. She had nothing to show him. No deed, no easement, no letter of agreement signed by anyone in his family, and instead told him that the authority of the homeowners association did not require his personal approval to exist. Grant gave her a clear warning that day: any future entry onto his property would be documented and pursued under the law. Whitney left with a threat of her own, telling him he would regret standing against an entire community, her voice rising as she climbed back into her car. The next morning, Grant woke to the sound of a chainsaw echoing up from the direction of the creek before the sun had even fully cleared the ridgeline. He drove down the old logging road on his utility vehicle and found Darren Winslow, a local landscaping contractor with 2 decades of experience, working alongside 4 crew members, clearing brush, driving marker stakes, spray painting trees for removal. Whitney stood in the middle of it all, holding rolled-up blueprints for the nature loop, as though the forest already belonged to her association. Grant ordered everyone to stop working and leave the property immediately, and Darren explained that Whitney had signed a contract on behalf of the homeowners association, claiming they held rights to access this exact stretch of land, showing Grant a copy with the association letterhead printed across the top. When Grant asked to see a permit, Darren could only produce paperwork for interior landscaping work inside Silver Pines Estates, nothing that authorized anyone to touch land outside the development. Whitney insisted the boundary map Grant relied on was outdated, claiming the association had its own survey provided by the original developer years earlier, though she could not say who had prepared it or when. Grant photographed the license plates, the equipment, the crew, the stake locations, and every tree that had already been marked or cut, working methodically from one end of the disturbance to the other. He called the sheriff's office, and since no major damage had occurred yet and the boundary was technically in dispute, the dispatcher advised him to order the crew off his land and to keep gathering evidence for his file. Grant read a formal trespass warning aloud in front of his own security camera, his voice calm and steady, and Darren, sensing real trouble, ordered his crew to shut down the saws before anything worse happened. Whitney grew furious and insisted Grant had no authority to dismiss a contractor working for the association, planting her hands on her hips as though sheer volume might settle the matter. Grant showed her the digital parcel map on his tablet where the boundary line sat clearly more than 40 feet from the edge of the development, the county's own stamp visible in the corner of the screen. She tore up the copy of the warning he handed her and threw it on the ground before storming off, promising that the project would continue because the entire board had already approved it. Grant walked the site afterward and counted 6 young trees, cut down 3 warning signs torn from their posts, and 17 fresh stakes driven deep into his soil, each one photographed with a ruler beside it for scale. He began building a detailed log that day, tracking every date, every person involved, every piece of equipment, and every dollar it would eventually cost to repair what had been done, filing each entry in a plain manila folder that would soon grow far too thick to close. Grant did not send a bill yet. He wanted to give Whitney one real chance to stop before things escalated any further, so he waited, watched his cameras, and kept every photograph organized by date and location. 2 days later, an official-looking notice arrived from the association itself, claiming Grant had violated the landscaping standards of Silver Pines Estates, and demanding he allow the trail project to continue without further interference, complete with a fabricated fine of $2,500 printed at the bottom. He called the association office and asked how a private organization could possibly fine a man who had never joined it in the first place. Colleen Voss, the association's financial manager, sounded genuinely confused on the phone, admitting she could not find his name anywhere on the membership rolls or in any dues records, and that she had never actually approved the notice herself. Whitney grabbed the phone from her and claimed Grant's property fell inside what she called the aesthetic influence zone of the association, a term with no legal meaning whatsoever, and one she seemed to be inventing as she spoke. When Grant asked her to cite the actual bylaw supporting that claim, she abruptly ended the call rather than admit she had none. He reached out to Tessa Langford, a real estate attorney, specializing in boundary disputes with a reputation for methodical, unshakable preparation, who quickly confirmed the association had absolutely no legal authority over his land. Tessa advised Grant to send a formal cease and desist letter, demand the fraudulent invoice be withdrawn, and begin preserving every scrap of documentation tied to the Nature Loop project going forward. Grant also hired Wade Merrick, a licensed land surveyor known throughout the county for his precision and his refusal to cut corners, to complete a fresh and fully certified survey along the entire eastern boundary line. Whitney somehow learned about the survey and showed up a second time, this time bringing Marjorie Prescott, the association's vice president, along with someone recording video for the association's records, apparently intending to build a story of her own. She deliberately stood in front of Wade's equipment, calling the survey itself an act of intimidation against the community, her arms crossed as if daring anyone to move her. Wade calmly explained that he was a licensed professional, working entirely within the boundaries of Grant's own land, and that he had no intention of stopping. Whitney stepped over the fence line, grabbed one of the survey flags, and threw it into the creek in a fit of open defiance, the small orange marker bobbing downstream before disappearing beneath a rock. Grant recorded the entire exchange without saying a word, letting the footage speak for itself, while Tessa prepared a final written warning, stating that any further entry after this point would be treated as intentional and would carry real consequences. Whitney read that warning aloud at the next association meeting, but twisted its meaning entirely, telling residents that Grant was trying to seal off their only emergency exit road and leave families trapped in the event of a wildfire. Several frightened residents voted to grant her extra funding to, in her words, protect their right of access from an unreasonable neighbor, applauding as though they had just approved something noble. Whitney used that money to send Darren and his crew right back onto the property to finish what they had started, this time arriving before dawn to avoid another confrontation. Grant realized this was no longer a misunderstanding between neighbors. Whitney was deliberately constructing a false narrative to extract money from her own residents while stealing the use of land that was never hers to take. And hidden cameras soon caught her personally unlocking his side gate at 5:42 in the morning, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had clearly done it before. Grant reviewed the footage and watched Whitney cut the lock on his secondary gate herself, waving in a flatbed truck and a small excavator behind her as casually as if she were directing traffic in her own driveway. Darren had apparently warned her earlier that the contract carried serious legal risk, but Whitney handed him an insurance certificate and swore the association would cover any consequences that followed, brushing off his concerns with a wave of her hand. The crew graded nearly 600 feet of forest road that day, cutting drainage trenches, hauling in crushed gravel, and felling 14 more mature trees along the way, the sound of engines carrying far beyond the property line. They even rerouted a small branch of the creek to make room for their equipment, leaving the natural drainage pattern permanently disturbed until it could be repaired by someone who actually understood what they were doing. Whitney had 2 large signs installed near the worksite reading Silver Pines Private Nature Trail, as though the land already belonged to her development and always had. Grant did not confront the crew right away. He let his fixed cameras, a small drone, and time-stamped photographs quietly build an airtight record of everything happening on his property, resisting every urge to march down and put a stop to it in the moment. Once the evidence was complete, he arrived with Tessa and Wade, and Tessa personally handed Darren and Whitney a formal legal notice, proving the true boundary line beyond any doubt, laying it flat across the hood of a nearby truck for everyone to see. Wade replanted the survey stakes on the spot, showing the entire work site sat between 38 and 71 feet inside Grant's land numbers. He read aloud slowly so no one could later claim confusion. Darren immediately ordered his crew to shut everything down, realizing he could now be held personally liable for continuing his earlier confidence draining from his face. Whitney tore up the survey printout and insisted the association would sue for a right of use based on years of supposed prior access, though she still could not name a single resident who had ever used that road before this year. Tessa explained plainly that occasional unauthorized foot traffic never creates a legal easement, especially on land that had always carried fencing and posted warning signs going back decades. Whitney ordered the crew to keep working anyway, but not a single worker moved, each of them glancing instead toward Darren for guidance. She climbed onto the excavator herself and shifted the bucket slightly, apparently trying to prove she still controlled the site even as her own contractor stepped back and shook his head. Grant called the sheriff, and Boyd Kessler arrived within minutes, ordering everyone off the property until the boundary dispute could be formally resolved through the proper channels. Whitney claimed Grant was essentially holding the association's equipment hostage by locking his own gate, but she ultimately agreed to let the machines be removed under the sheriff's direct supervision, though not before promising loudly for the benefit of anyone still listening that she would return with a court order of her own. That night, Whitney sent an email to every resident of Silver Pines Estates announcing that the Nature Loop would officially open that coming Saturday warning notice, or not framing it as a triumphant community event. She told residents that Grant had quietly agreed to allow temporary access, a claim that was completely untrue, and one she must have known would eventually be exposed. On Saturday morning, Grant discovered more than 30 adults gathered near his gate, no children among them, all waiting for what Whitney called the community trail, opening, many holding coffee cups and cameras as though attending a ribbon cutting downtown. She wore a jacket stitched with the association's logo, cut a symbolic ribbon strung between 2 fence posts, and led the group straight through the gate she had already left unlocked the night before. Grant met them at the boundary line without raising his voice, calmly informing the crowd they were standing on private land, and had been misled by their own association president, watching the confusion ripple across dozens of unsuspecting faces. Most residents turned back the moment they saw Wade's certified survey documents and heard about the sheriff's earlier warning, several of them apologizing to Grant on their way out. Whitney screamed that Grant was forging paperwork and trying to steal what she called community property right out from under everyone, her voice cracking with a desperation that surprised even her closest allies. Marjorie began to quietly doubt her own president that day. Since Whitney had previously claimed she already held a court order, yet now could not produce a single document to prove it under pressure. Sheriff Boyd arrived with 2 deputies after Grant reported a mass trespass in progress, and he ordered the entire crowd to leave the property immediately, his tone leaving no room for further debate. Whitney argued loudly but eventually complied, and Grant chose not to press charges against the misled residents, asking only that the report formally name Whitney as the organizer who led them there in the first place. After the failed opening, Tessa sent the association a broader evidence preservation request covering emails, meeting minutes, contracts, and every financial record connected to the Nature Loop, warning that destroying any of it would carry its own consequences. Grant also received a formal environmental damage assessment warning that the rerouted creek water could cause serious erosion if it was not professionally restored before the rainy season began in earnest. Tessa combined every figure into a running total, applying the trespassing fees the earlier written warnings had already established under the terms of Colorado property law. The preliminary number climbed past $80,000, though Grant chose not to send a bill just yet, sensing Whitney would keep making mistakes if she believed she had not been caught yet. Marjorie reached out to Grant privately soon after, revealing that Whitney had lied to the entire board about who actually owned that land and had signed contracts no one else had approved, and that the true financial damage ran even deeper than anyone realized, including $42,000 quietly pulled from the association's reserve fund. Marjorie met Grant and Tessa quietly at the attorney's office and laid out copies of the original meeting minutes on the table between them, her hands trembling slightly as she spread the pages out. Those minutes showed the board had approved only a feasibility survey with a budget of $7,500, never full construction of any kind, and certainly nothing resembling what had already been built. Whitney had altered the official record after the meeting, transforming a small research budget into apparent authorization for the entire project, changing dates and dollar figures with a steady, practiced hand. The signatures of 2 board members had clearly been copied from an unrelated document and pasted onto the falsified minutes, a detail Marjorie noticed only after comparing the fonts under bright light. Colleen Voss began cooperating as well once she noticed a pattern of strange and unexplained invoices moving through the association's accounts over the previous several months. Whitney had split Darren's payments into smaller pieces, each one deliberately kept below the threshold that would have required full board approval before release. One payment labeled as legal consulting went to a company owned by a close personal friend of Whitney's despite no actual service ever being performed for that fee, a fact Colleen confirmed with a single phone call. Grant understood by then that Whitney's goal was never simply a walking trail. She wanted a flashy new amenity to advertise Silver Pines, estates raise home values across the development, and cement her own grip on the presidency for years to come, positioning herself as the visionary who had transformed the neighborhood. She had also planned to charge residents a special maintenance fee once she secured control of the disputed land, turning her theft into a permanent and recurring source of income for herself and her allies on the board. Tessa recommended splitting the case into 2 separate tracks moving forward, believing a single sprawling complaint would only slow everything down. The first would pursue civil compensation for the trespassing and the physical destruction of Grant's property backed entirely by documented evidence. The second would quietly hand the internal financial misconduct over to the association's own board, and if necessary, to the appropriate authorities for further review. Grant had no interest in financially ruining innocent families who lived nearby and had simply been lied to by someone they trusted. He decided instead to direct the compensation demand squarely at the association and at Whitney personally, since her actions had clearly been deliberate, repeated, and impossible to explain away as a simple misunderstanding. Wade delivered his final certified survey confirming once and for all that no public road, no historic easement, and no legitimate right of access had ever existed on that land, a conclusion stamped and signed under his professional license. A forestry specialist calculated the value of every tree, every yard of disturbed soil, and the total cost of proper restoration, walking the site with Grant for the better part of an entire afternoon. An environmental engineer added that the creek needed to be repaired before seasonal flooding made the damage permanent and far more expensive to fix down the road. Tessa combined every number, layering in the trespassing penalties that had already been clearly established through written warning after written warning sent over the preceding weeks. The final total came to exactly $98,500, a figure Tessa double-checked twice before printing the invoice. That figure was built from $18,400 in tree loss and landscape damage, $21,600 to restore the forest road and remove the crushed gravel, and $16,700 in tree loss, $50 to repair the creek and prevent further erosion along its banks. Add to that $9,250 for the surveying and remarking of boundaries, $7,800 for replacing broken gates, locks, and signage, and $13,200 in legal and administrative fees accumulated over the course of the entire dispute. The remaining $11,500 covered the penalty for continued unauthorized commercial use of the land after formal warnings had already been delivered in writing on multiple separate occasions. Tessa explained each line item to Grant one evening at her office, walking him through the math slowly, since she wanted him to understand exactly why the number sat where it did, rather than simply trusting her calculations. Grant appreciated that transparency more than he let on, since it meant nothing about the figure could ever later be dismissed as inflated, exaggerated, or invented out of simple frustration. Every dollar traced back to a receipt, a professional estimate, or a documented hour of legal work, and Tessa reminded him that a number built on evidence was far harder to argue against than one built on anger. Grant signed the final invoice himself, reading it over one last time at his kitchen table, and asked Tessa to deliver it directly into Whitney's hands at the very next association meeting in front of everyone who had gathered there. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, packed with adult residents, eager to see how the dispute would finally be settled after weeks of rumors and half-truths. Whitney opened by accusing Grant of holding the entire community hostage and blocking a project meant to benefit everyone who lived there, her voice carrying the same confident tone she had used from the very beginning. Grant arrived with Tessa, Wade, Marjorie, and Colleen standing beside him, a lineup that visibly unsettled Whitney the moment she noticed them near the back of the room. Whitney immediately tried to argue that Grant had no right to speak since he was not a member of the association, gesturing sharply toward the door. Marjorie used her authority as vice president to add an emergency item to the agenda before anyone could stop her, silencing the room with a single raised hand. Tessa then walked forward and placed a thick envelope directly in Whitney's hands, containing the demand for $98,500, the certified survey photographs of every stage of damage, and a formal notice of personal liability spelled out in plain language. Whitney stared at the number and laughed, insisting Grant had no authority whatsoever to fine an entire homeowners association for simply trying to improve the neighborhood. Grant calmly clarified that this was never an arbitrary fine imposed by him personally, but a documented demand for real damages, unauthorized use of private land, and the cost of full restoration down to the last tree. Tessa displayed footage on the projector showing Whitney unlocking the gate, directing contractors onto the property, and organizing the mass trespass that Saturday morning, the room falling completely silent as the images played across the batter screen. Recorded audio confirmed she had been personally warned by the sheriff himself weeks earlier, her own voice arguing with Boyd Kessler crackling through the clubhouse speakers. Wade presented his certified boundary map to the entire room, tracing the true property line with a steady finger for anyone who still doubted it. Colleen followed by revealing financial records, showing Whitney had spent tens of thousands of dollars far beyond her actual authority, passing printed copies down each row of folding chairs. Marjorie placed both the original and the falsified meeting minutes side by side for everyone to compare, the discrepancies obvious even from several rows back. The mood in the room shifted completely within minutes, murmurs of disbelief rippling from one resident to the next. Residents who had once trusted Whitney without question began asking pointed questions she could no longer avoid, her carefully rehearsed answers falling apart under the weight of the evidence stacked against her. She accused everyone present of conspiring against her and threatened to use the association's reserve fund to sue Grant personally, instead, though the threat landed with far less force than it once might have. Tessa then revealed one final detail that changed everything because Whitney had continued trespassing after receiving direct personal warnings. The association's liability insurance was likely to deny coverage entirely, leaving her exposed to full personal financial responsibility for every dollar of damage she had caused. Grant gave the board 10 days to accept a structured payment plan and sign a permanent agreement to stop all future trespassing, his tone firm, but never raised above a normal speaking voice. Whitney tore the first page of the invoice apart in frustration, the paper fluttering to the floor near her feet, and when Grant simply handed her another copy, he mentioned quietly that 11 more identical copies had already been distributed to every relevant party from the sheriff's office to the association's own insurer. The very next morning, Whitney returned to Grant's property alone, carrying a shovel and clearly intending to dig up one of the newly placed survey stakes before anyone could stop her. A motion-triggered camera alerted Grant's phone just after sunrise, catching her parked along the road and climbing over the fence line by herself, moving quickly through the early morning fog. She dug around one marker, wrenched it out of the ground, and tossed it into a drainage ditch without a second thought. Breathing hard from the effort, Grant did not confront her directly this time. He simply called Sheriff Boyd and continued recording everything from a safe distance, watching as Whitney pulled down a second warning sign and sprayed black paint over the most visible camera she could find mounted near the old logging road. She had no idea 3 additional hidden cameras were quietly capturing every movement she made from angles she had never thought to check. Sheriff Boyd arrived and found Whitney still holding the shovel, standing squarely on Grant's land, with no possible excuse left to offer for her presence there. She claimed she was simply protecting association property from what she called fraudulent surveying practices, gesturing wildly toward the disturbed stake at her feet. Wade was called to the scene and confirmed the disturbed stake was an official certified survey marker and that deliberately tampering with it could carry real legal consequences under state law. When Boyd asked whether Grant had given her permission to be there that day, Whitney refused to answer the question directly, looking away toward the tree line instead. And Grant played the footage of her climbing the fence and pulling the stake from the ground right there on the spot for the sheriff to see with his own eyes. Sheriff Boyd arrested Whitney for trespassing after formal warning, destruction of property, and interference with a licensed survey marker, reading her the charges in a flat professional tone. She demanded the sheriff arrest Grant instead for recording her without permission, her voice rising in disbelief as the handcuffs closed around her wrists. Boyd calmly reminded her that a property owner has every right to place cameras on his own land, and that nothing about her arrest depended on Grant's cooperation at all. Word of Whitney being led away spread through Silver Pines estates within hours, passed from porch to porch faster than any official announcement could have traveled. Some residents refused to believe it at first, insisting there had to be some misunderstanding, until Marjorie confirmed the arrest herself during an impromptu gathering near the community mailboxes. Others admitted quietly that they had noticed small inconsistencies in Whitney's stories for months, but had never wanted to be the one to question a woman so certain of herself. The board called an emergency session and immediately suspended every one of her remaining powers as president, voting unanimously without a single objection raised. The association's insurance company opened its own investigation into whether her actions fell so far outside her official duties that no coverage would apply at all, while Tessa quietly added the new damage to the file, though Grant agreed to hold the total steady at $98,500 if the association moved quickly to make things right. Whitney's attorney soon offered Grant $25,000 to drop every claim and keep the entire matter quiet, framing it as a generous gesture of goodwill meant to spare everyone further embarrassment. Grant read the offer twice, set it down on the table between them, and asked Tessa what she thought, before saying a single word aloud. Grant refused outright since that amount barely covered restoration costs and offered no lasting protection for his land going forward into the future. Tessa laid out the real terms of any settlement instead. Full payment of the $98,500, the association covering every restoration expense, and a signed written acknowledgement that the land had never belonged to Silver Pines Estates in any form whatsoever. The agreement also barred the association, its contractors, and its residents from ever entering the property again without explicit written permission, required Whitney to resign from every leadership role she held, and demanded the association void the fraudulent fines it had originally issued against Grant. It further required the association to update every piece of marketing material and to install a permanent boundary fence entirely at its own expense. The new interim board, temporarily led by Marjorie, wanted to settle quickly given how overwhelming the evidence against Whitney had become in such a short span of time. Colleen confirmed the association still had enough money in its insurance reserves and unspent project budget to cover the full amount without charging residents a single additional dollar out of pocket. The insurance company agreed to pay a portion of the damages but firmly refused to cover anything tied to Whitney's intentional actions after she had already been formally warned in writing. Whitney was forced to sell a personal investment property just to cover her share of the settlement, a fact that quietly spread through the neighborhood within days. Her attorney briefly argued that Grant had allowed the damage to continue on purpose simply to inflate his claim. A theory Grant dismantled easily with the long stack of warnings, phone calls, and police reports he had filed from the very beginning of the dispute. Darren Winslow testified that Whitney had personally pressured him to keep working even after being shown clear proof of the true boundary line, describing conversations where she dismissed his concerns outright. He explained that she had told him repeatedly not to worry, that she had handled bigger obstacles than one stubborn landowner before, and that the association's attorney would smooth everything over if it ever came to that. Hearing his own words played back during the proceedings seemed to unsettle Whitney more than any of the financial records had, since it stripped away any pretense that she had acted out of confusion rather than calculation. The full board eventually voted to accept every term of the settlement without exception, closing the matter once and for all. Whitney was required to sign a document formally admitting she had never held any right to step onto Grant's land at any point during the entire dispute. The full $98,500 was placed into a trust account, earmarked entirely for restoring the damaged property to its original condition. The remaining minor criminal charges were resolved separately through fines, probation, and a permanent order barring her from ever coming near Grant's property again. And Grant took no real satisfaction in her financial ruin, wanting only an end to the trespassing and a boundary that could never again be twisted or ignored by anyone. Once restoration crews began their work, they uncovered something buried beneath a pile of crushed gravel near the old logging road, a discovery that stopped the entire crew in their tracks. It was the original warning sign, the very one Whitney had ordered torn down and hidden, months earlier, planted more than 3 decades ago by Grant's own grandfather with his own 2 hands. Faint lettering was still visible across its weathered surface, reading Hollis Property Private Land. The paint chipped but unmistakably legible after all those years underground. The discovery carried a quiet symbolism. No one in Redstone Hollow would soon forget, since Whitney had tried to bury the proof of ownership only for her own destructive actions to unearth it again for everyone to see with their own eyes. The restoration team cleared away every trace of crushed gravel, rebuilt the natural drainage system stone by stone, and guided the diverted creek water back into its original channel over the course of several weeks. 20 replacement trees, all native to the region, and larger than the ones that had been lost, were planted along the damaged stretch of forest under Grant's careful supervision. The land would need time to fully recover, but it was no longer anyone's construction site, and the sound of chainsaws had finally given way to birdsong once again. A sturdy new fence and gate were installed directly along the certified boundary line, paid for entirely by the association from start to finish. Every piece of marketing material for Silver Pines Estates was updated to remove any mention or image of the nature loop that had never legally existed in the first place. Marjorie was elected the association's new president soon after running unopposed on a simple promise of transparency and careful oversight. In her first address to residents, she admitted openly that the board had failed to ask basic questions before approving Whitney's plans, and she promised that kind of blind trust would never again substitute for due diligence at Silver Pines Estates. She introduced a strict new rule requiring every future project to be reviewed by an independent attorney to confirm legal ownership before any work could begin. A policy the board adopted without a single dissenting vote. Colleen published a fully transparent financial report for every resident to review at their leisure, restoring a measure of trust that had been badly shaken. Darren personally apologized to Grant and offered to help finish part of the restoration work at no additional cost, a gesture Grant quietly appreciated more than he let on. Whitney eventually sold her home and left Silver Pines Estates entirely, having lost nearly every ounce of community support she once commanded so effortlessly. Grant received the final payment confirming that the full $98,500 had been paid in complete and formal settlement of every claim, the wire transfer arriving on a quiet Tuesday morning. He framed a copy of that very first invoice, not as some kind of trophy to admire, but as a quiet reminder that careful documentation had always been far more powerful than shouting matches ever could be. Months later, the forest began turning green again. The creek finally settled back into its proper course, and the last of the survey paint slowly faded from the bark of the surviving trees along the boundary line. Grant stood near the new gate one afternoon when Marjorie arrived to deliver the final signed copy of the settlement agreement, the paperwork tucked neatly beneath her arm. She asked almost hesitantly whether the association might one day be allowed to hold a simple cleanup day along the public land, just outside his boundary, careful not to overstep even an inch. Grant agreed without hesitation, recognizing that for the very first time, the association had actually asked permission before setting foot anywhere near his land at all. Residents who once believed Whitney's version of events later admitted they had simply trusted a familiar face without ever asking to see the paperwork behind her. Claims a mistake. Several of them promised never to repeat with the future board or any future president, no matter how confident that person might sound. Marjorie's new leadership brought a slower, quieter kind of progress to Silver Pines Estates, one built on signed agreements instead of confident announcements. And the community seemed, if anything, more at ease for it. Grant occasionally saw hikers pause respectfully at his new fence line reading the replacement sign. His grandfather would have recognized instantly, then turning back the way they came without a word of protest. Where Whitney's crew had once carved a rough construction road through the trees, wildflowers now pushed up through the settling soil each spring, slowly softening the scars left behind by the excavator and the crushed gravel. The old logging road slowly disappeared, beneath fresh undergrowth, reclaimed by the forest it had always belonged to. Wade still drove past from time to time, checking on the boundary markers out of professional habit more than necessity, and Tessa occasionally called just to confirm the settlement payments were arriving on schedule, though they always did. Right down to the final installment. Whitney had once believed her position gave her the right to walk through any boundary she pleased, certain that confidence alone could substitute for a deed. But in the end, $98,500 taught her a lesson. No title or position ever could. A lesson written in survey stakes, in restored creek water, and in the quiet, steady patience of a man who simply refused to be pushed off his own land. A gate never has to stand very tall when the law is the one holding it shut.